My name is Charles Gary Kahane. I was born April 17th, 1950 in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. My parents were Jack Kahane and Maxine. Jack Kahane's family came from New York, Toronto via the immigrant process and migrated across Canada to Winnipeg in the early 1900s. My mother's family was from two different places in Europe and settled in Omaha, Nebraska. The two of them met during and at the end of World War II. They had Canadian relatives on both sides that brought them together as mutual friends, and they were married in the early 40s. I have a sister named Charlotte who is 3 years older than me. She was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada as well in 1947. I currently reside in Missoula, Montana. She resides in Florida.
Tell me a little bit about your parents.
Well, my father owned a company called Kahane of Canada Limited in Winnipeg, Manitoba. In the early 50s, the company was involved in making glassware and china and decor items, Russell Wright china, Devonware decor, and some glassware for companies like Max Factor and Revlon. Also had considerable experience in depth in casting bronze at Kahane of Canada. My father was artistic in nature. His brother Maurice ended up an international art dealer. My father's other brothers, one was a dentist, Leonard Kahane, and the other one, Bernard Kahane, is a professor at McGill University in semantics. My mother was educated as a dancer, but later in life got her master's degree in speech pathology at the University in Omaha, and spent some time teaching people who were stroke victims how to speak again. My mother was trained as a ballet dancer early on in life, and when she and my father met, I think it was largely because of a social event they went to. And I think my father, as it was related to me by others, was captivated by my mother's dancing ability. So that's how the romance began. In 1955, they were divorced, and I moved with my mother and sister to Council Bluffs, Iowa, where my grandmother and grandfather resided at the time. My grandfather was Abe Leibovitz. My grandmother was Esther Leibovitz. I know considerable about their histories individually. My grandfather came from Lithuania on a steam freighter at the age of 13 years old. Initially, I believe he stowed away, but he was befriended by some of the people on the ship, so that when it got to Ellis Island, my grandfather was given the name Abe. His name was Avrum, and the ship's captain helped him through the immigration process. And of course, shortly thereafter, he got on an immigrant train to the Midwest. He came as far as Omaha, Nebraska, and worked in several different labor positions, and eventually acceded to enough wealth that he could bring his entire family to the United States. His father's name was Charles Leibovitz. He brought his mother and father here, and his mother passed away. Charles went back to Lithuania, ostensibly in the early 1930s, although there's some debate about that, and there is a grave marker in Bicher Cemetery that says Charles Leibovitz, but it's missing the I in Leibovitz. It's spelled L-E-B-O-V-I-T-Z, and Abe spelled his name L-E-I-B-O-V-I-T-Z. Abe had brothers and sisters, all of which he brought to the United States as well, which was the norm then. One family member would come here and then work and get enough passage to bring family one at a time or in groups to the country. He had a brother named Louis B. Leibovitz who settled in Chicago and worked for Kellogg's of Battle Creek, Michigan for 40 years as a salesman. Another brother named Sam Leibovitz who settled in California and worked for PepsiCo for 28 years. A sister named Claire, one of my favorite great aunts, who eventually married a gentleman, and they retired to Arizona, and of course didn't meet them until later in life, in the mid-60s. My grandmother's side is a little bit different story. I know that her father's name was Wolf Siegel. Her mother's name was Clara, and we called her Baba Chaya. I didn't ever know her, but I felt as if I knew her through the pictures that were present throughout the house and through the memories that my grandmother kept alive of her. When my sister and I came to Council Bluffs, Iowa in 1955, we had been privileged in Winnipeg to have a Jewish upbringing. We were members of Sher Zedek congregation. And I do recall from the age of 3 to 5 being picked up by a car and taken to Hebrew school at Sher Zedek. I know that by the time I came here at the age of 5 years old, I had a functional working knowledge of Hebrew. However, when I got to Council Bluffs in 1955, there was a small Jewish congregation there with a Hebrew school and a Sunday school. And I tried as much as possible to retain as much of the use of the language, but summarily lost it until about 1962, when the congregation hired a second rabbi that I was exposed to in that congregation, who was named Jay Karzin. The first rabbi I was exposed to made quite an impression in my life. His name was David Korb. His son's name was Larry Korb, and his son was my age, and we became friends. I was kind of reluctant to get involved with the kids in Council Bluffs because they didn't speak Hebrew. And of course, all we used in Sher Zedek during Sunday school was Hebrew. So I really didn't know how to communicate with these kids. And yet, by 1962, the congregation had embarked on a program to rebuild the synagogue in Council Bluffs with the help of several members of the congregation. In 1963, I was bar mitzvahed in the interim facility, which was an old church on Pierce, which was used for a short time while they remodeled the synagogue in Council Bluffs. And I had my bar mitzvah in that recycled church, which was the temporary headquarters, in May 18th of 1963. Moved to Omaha in December of 1963 with my mother and grandmother, because the piece of property that my grandmother owned in Council Bluffs was claimed by right of eminent domain by the Interstate Highway Commission. So the house I lived in Council Bluffs, Iowa, which was on 37th and Broadway, is no longer there. We became members of Congregation Temple Israel because the house they purchased in Omaha was located on 74th Avenue in Cass, just 5-6 blocks away from Temple Israel. At that time, I became acquainted with Rabbi Sidney Brooks. He helped me to continue to at least reawaken some of the familiarity with Hebrew in me. And from there, I became a member of AZA 100 in Omaha. At the same time, I joined National Federation of Temple Youth, known as NIFTY to me at the time. And I met a young fella named Jerry Gorelick. Later to find out Jerry was the son of Mickey Gorelick, then the editor of the Jewish Press. Jerry and I remain friends to this day. I can tell you that my grandmother's family, that would be Wolf and Clara Siegel, came here from Romania, ostensibly in 1903 on a steamship, deck passage, and that there were 3 more sisters besides my grandmother. All of them settled in this area. Sylvia was the baby, and born in 1901. My grandmother, Esther Leibovitz, who was Esther Siegel Leibovitz, was born in 1900. Etta was older than grandmother and Aunt Sylvia, but well, I was never sure how much older. And her name, she married Joe Rosen, and her son was Eddie Rosen here in Omaha, who became later on a Chevrolet dealer. The fourth sister was the oldest, and her name was Rose, or Aunt Razola. And she married a gentleman in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, which began the Canada Association with other relatives, which my mother later met her husband Jack through. This was not to be the last of my mother's marriages. After the divorce, many years later, she married again. Hopefully I can get to that. Anyway, the Siegel family, Wolf and Clara and their 4 daughters, settled in Omaha, and for a time were grocers, greengrocers, and what you would call today, by today's standards, peddlers. The eventuality was that Esther eloped with Abe Leibovitz in 1917. Abe had by then also purchased a grocery store in South Omaha, down on 6th Street. That was the first of several grocery stores Abe and Esther owned. Abe was a hard worker, but not very well educated, since his education had gone through an interruption when he came to the United States. He was 13 years old. And we can only figure that since there was 7 years between Esther and Abe in age, this was somewhere around 1906 or so, because he would have been about 13 years old then. At one time, they owned the Madison Avenue Grocery, but then summarily sold that to Ben and Sylvia Telpner. Uncle Ben married Aunt Sylvia, who was the baby sister of my grandmother. My grandfather, Abe Leibovitz, owned a number of grocery stores in both Omaha and Council Bluffs, all small neighborhood markets, and then moved to Council Bluffs, preferring it to the amount of building and development that was going on in Omaha, Nebraska, in the early 1920s. They bought a house on 37th and Broadway, and my grandmother resided in that until it was claimed by the Highway Commission in 1963. When we moved to Omaha in 1963 and I began to meet other Jewish kids, I realized I was no longer in such a small community, because Council Bluffs had about 60 to 70 Jewish families. Prior to that, my community was very small. I felt like a very small fish in a big pond in 1963. If I hadn't met Jerry, I don't know that I would have found a way inside the social groups that were already defined in the early 60s of Jewish kids in Omaha. But because of those friendships and the other ones that I made along the way, I became a part of the Jewish community here until I graduated high school. After that, I tried to maintain ties to the community, even though I left at the age of 30 and moved to California. My sister had left Omaha several years before, having married a guy in the Air Force, a Jewish fellow named Jeff Krauser, who had graduated from the academy and was stationed at SAC. Charlotte was residing in Phoenix. My mother had remarried in 1973, just shortly after my sister got married, and I was working for a theatrical corporation in San Francisco and came back for the wedding. My mother then married Norman T. Rosen. Norman Rosen was the father of Steve Rosen, my pledge son in AZA 100. So it's kind of an interesting connection. Norm worked for Phil and Harley Schrager for about 25 years here in Omaha as a salesman. My mother and my then widowed grandmother and Norm resided at Richland Park after that for a number of years, and a couple of other apartment communities throughout Omaha. And my father passed away some 12 years, my stepfather Norm passed away some 12 years later. My grandmother had passed away in the interim, and my mother was left to her own devices and elected to stay in the Jewish community in Omaha. In 1990, she moved into a building on 90th and just off of Dodge called Embassy Park, where, as I perceived it, there was an enclave of other Jewish widows and people who lived in the building, and she felt comfortable there. I guess when I look back on that, that was the logical choice for her, although my sister and I had made offers to her to come live with either of us. At the time, I had a daughter, and she was about 10 years old when we moved to Montana in 1990. My mother passed away in 1993, and I've resided in Missoula, Montana, actually in the community of Lolo, just outside of Missoula, ever since then. The early years for me in Council Bluffs, Iowa, might have been more difficult, but for the fact that I had my grandmother's sisters' families, and they were fairly close-knit. The daughter of Sylvia, her baby sister, had 4 children. The oldest was Gene Telpner, and he became a journalist and a Juno Award winner in Canada. The next child would have been, I believe, Audrey, and she's married to Maury Shapiro here in Omaha, Nebraska. And they're still both alive, and I spoke to Audrey this morning. And while she was on the way to one of numerous doctor's appointments, she's well. They have 2 children, Lisa and David, both grown, and both involved in their own professional and personal lives. And Lisa married Denny Lewis. David is a single male and lives with Maury and Audrey. Their commitment to David has been something I would model part of my life after if I could. The next child was Maynard Telpner, who became the mayor of Council Bluffs in the late 1950s and early 60s. He was quite a young man when he ran for mayor, but he did indeed win. The other child was Zeph Telpner, known to us as Boonjug, ostensibly because he could not pronounce the word Junebug when he was young. I was at the cemetery a short while ago where I met the people who led me to this particular day with Ben Nachman, and at that point I found out that Boonjug, or Zeph, had died in January 3rd of this year, 2006. All of my family is buried in the cemetery in Council Bluffs, Iowa, all my immediate family, and some of my good friends from Hebrew school. Bradley Sperling is also buried there. Some of the people that I learned later on were instrumental in getting me here. Ben Telpner's sister, my Aunt Sylvia's husband, Ben Telpner's sister, Ida Robinson. When we came to the United States in 1955, as children, my sister and I needed sponsors. And Ida was one of the people who sponsored us because we needed to attain citizenship. We were both Canadians, natural born. And without Ida, I doubt that it would have been a smoother process. I don't know that I've left anything out up to high school, but I'll say that when we moved to Omaha in 1963, I was suddenly immersed in a much bigger family of Jewish people in the community. I had up to that point very few Jewish friends, so for me it was a happy time. I became a song leader in the National Federation of Temple Youth. I became active in AZA 100, and those were my primary involvements because I really didn't have, aside from my musical endeavors in high school, I didn't have a great deal of interest in becoming involved with other aspects of the community. I was a cellist, and I had been trained as a cellist since 1958. And so I was involved in the Youth Symphony in Omaha at that point. And I met a man named Joseph Levine, another Jewish man who was the conductor of the Omaha Symphony. His wife, Mary, became a good friend. They had 2 sons, David and young Joe, who moved on as Joe's contract with the symphony expired a number of years later. I spent considerable time with the Levine family over the years, and my musical education became the preeminent thing in my life. I thought I was destined for a career in music, and so during the summers from 1962 to 1965, I attended a music camp in Colorado, and I was lucky enough to, I don't think that my family had enough money at the time to send me. I was lucky enough to get scholarships to the camp. I continue to play the cello to this day, and I have several people to thank for my involvement in music. Much later, I became a professional musician for a number of years. I worked for a company called Theatrical Corporation of America in San Francisco, touring with several different touring groups, and then came back to Omaha in 1973 and went to work here as a professional musician at a number of bars, restaurants, and nightclubs. And then I was contracted to another company after that, and that took me out of Omaha for a few years. I was married in 1975 to a woman named Cynthia Meyer from Wayne, Nebraska. Although Meyer is a traditional sounding Jewish name, they were a German immigrant descent and Lutheran. Out of that marriage came a daughter, Annetta Rose Kahane, my only child, and she's currently 27 years old. She was born in January of 1979, on the 29th of January, and she's currently a school teacher and teaches in Montana in the area of Lolo, Florence, and Stevensville, Montana. She is currently engaged to Devin Jackson, who is the son of author John Jackson, who writes mystery novels, and both of them quite interesting people. Devin and Rose have lived with me for 10 years, 11 years now, and are about to make the move out on their own. I guess if I've omitted a few things, some of them would be, I had a couple of interesting things happen to me in my childhood. There were some contradictions in my family that caused some difficulties over the period of 1955 to 1962. There was some legal problems for them over land in Iowa. There was my grandfather's suicide in 1956, in February of 56. Some of these things people would have thought would have traumatized my sister and I to a certain extent, but in reality we had two wonderful parents in the form of Esther Leibovitz and Maxine, my mother, who somehow found ways to surmount the difficulties in our childhood, and somehow we both became well-adjusted enough to go on and go to college and develop careers. My grandfather, Abe, came to a tragic end in Council Bluffs. His suicide was the result of a disagreement over a piece of land that ultimately was adjudged to be his, but which somebody was trying to gain control of, in light of the fact that the Highway Commission was going to condemn the property by right of eminent domain. The piece of land would have been worth a great deal of money. We think, and from all the evidence available, that this was the reason that my grandfather committed suicide, amongst other things. But there are a number of circumstances surrounding that which really don't matter today, except to say that the consensus among everybody I was able to talk with was that my grandfather was a wonderful, hardworking man, and that what happened at the end of his life was undeserved. I think this had a profound effect on my grandmother, who never married again. She was just a mere 56 years old when my grandfather died, and pretty much dedicated the rest of her life to helping raise my sister and I. There's no question in my mind, without that generation of people, my grandmother and her sisters, that my sister and I would have had a much more difficult time than we did. My mother took a job in 1956 at Control Data. Another year later at IBM Corporation as one of the first key punch operators in the system when punch cards were used to transmit data in business. She then moved on to Blue Cross Blue Shield after a bout with cancer in 1957, which nearly killed her, but came back from that because she had two little kids. She said later and just couldn't bear the thought of them being left alone. And she went to work for Blue Cross Blue Shield and eventually acceded to the position of head of membership after 17 years. She quit a few weeks before she was married again in 1973 to Norm Rosen. And she retired from Blue Cross Blue Shield at that time. Her mother was becoming geriatric and needed care and attention. And so all three of them sold the house on 74th and Cass and moved to one of several apartments, as I said earlier. My mom went back to college at the behest of my sister in 1972 and graduated and got her graduate degree and became a speech pathologist. Her practice was largely confined to people in the Jewish community, and oddly enough, several of those people were older than her and had suffered strokes and had speech impediments as a result. So her area of interest being speech pathology, she dedicated herself to teaching those people to speak well again. I met some of those people in the subsequent aftermath of my moving away. I would come back, and without fail, they all told me they couldn't have learned to speak again without my mother. I attribute a good deal of my own propensity to use language to my mom. If I had two formative people in my life, they would probably be Esther Leibovitz and Maxine Kahane Rosen. I think I could probably say that they were the reasons that Charlotte and I had such a stable environment in light of the things that happened in Council Bluffs and the divorce my mother went through previous to that. In 1975, my father, Jack Kahane, in Canada, died. He had died of a coronary in the middle of winter, and I had been to see him 3 weeks before when he was in the hospital, in Misericordia Hospital in Winnipeg. I went back to bury him in late December of 1975, and I met one of his brothers, Bernard, again, and he's remained my Uncle Bernie to this day. He's still a professor of semantics at McGill University in Canada. And after the burial of my dad, at the age of 20, I was 25 years old at the time, I came back, and just shortly after that, I got married. It was a few months later. And actually, that's correct. And then remained in Omaha until 1980, and that's the year that I left and went to California, got a job at a bank. I actually was schooled in accounting here in Omaha at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, but never really had a particular fondness for it. However, the job got me the ability to bring the family out to California, and in the interim, my wife and daughter had stayed with my mother, my grandmother, and Norm Rosen in Omaha. All of them resided at Richland Park for about 6 months until I got well enough established in California. During that period of time in California, I stayed with Greta Cronenfeld. Greta Cronenfeld, interestingly enough, was the little sister of Abe Leibovitz, the youngest sister who I omitted mentioning. She was Greta Leibovitz, and so although she was the little sister of Abe, she was younger than my mother, but she took me in and gave me a place to stay while I got my first job in California. In 1990, I left California with my then wife, Cynthia, and my daughter, and moved to Montana, which is a dream I'd had for years, having been there in 1973 with the Serendipity Singers on a tour. I still today reside in Lolo, Montana, 10 miles outside of Missoula. I'm passionate about my fondness for the Pacific Northwest, and I expect that that's where I will reside for the rest of my days. That's how fond I am of it. I'm not sure, but I have come to find over the years that in some ways, to me, all roads lead back to Omaha. As a matter of course, in a way of relating this, whenever I come back here, I go to Bicker Cholim Cemetery to visit my mother's grave. I also see my grandmother and grandfather resting there, Sylvia and Ben Telpner resting there, some of Sylvia's children. And when I was here this last time, as I walked into the cemetery, there were 4 people looking at various parts of the cemetery and having a discussion. If it's true that all roads lead to Omaha, then that road then led me to them. Those 4 people that I met got into a dialogue with me in the cemetery, which led me to this day and this interview with Ben Nachman. And that's why I'm here. And I hope the oral history has been clear enough that you understand how Charles Kahane, today known as Skipper, thanks to his sister, Skip Kahane, resides in Montana, but comes back regularly to Omaha, not just to view the graves, but to see the remainder of his family, the relatives he has here. And somehow, 2 years ago, I opened a business in Nebraska with two partners called Noise Control Technologies. I'm an audio engineer today, and work in the area, and have cultivated relationships with people here once again. So perhaps that explains better why I say, at least in my life, for me this is true, all roads seem to lead to Omaha. I had heard that saying as a musician traveling years before, but never understood the full implications of it until I ran into those four people in the cemetery who invited me to do an interview and recite some of who I was and where I came from. It gave me pause to consider in the last couple of days just who I was and how I got here. And I guess that you can never really separate that from who you are, because today, while I reside in Missoula, Montana, and Lolo in the associated area, we have very few Jewish people in the community, but we do have a congregation. It is known as Har Shalom. We have an interim rabbi. We're attempting to fund a temporary building so that we can have a place to meet and hold services. We did Passover services in a historic hotel and a restaurant there, and it was a catered kosher Passover service. And I have to tell you, I never thought that I would see a Jewish community in my state in Montana, although there are others in the bigger cities. I reside in a pretty small city. But I was thrilled. I'm 56 years old, and from 1990 till the present, I had never been to a Jewish service in my state of Montana. This awakened a few things, because by virtue of our friendship, I got a phone call alerting me to this service from a woman named Sharon Tholt, who was Sharon Trachtenbart. Sharon comes from Omaha. We're about the same age. She called me up and asked me if I'd like to come to the Passover Seder with her. I said certainly, even though I knew that we both just simply needed an escort, and Sharon's been a good friend of mine for years, although we were both married and divorced since then. And I'm involved with a woman who lives in Omaha here. So I explained that to her, and she said, oh, that doesn't matter. I'd just love to have you come. So in the course of finding things in Montana to connect to, I found, again, some things in Omaha to connect to. This sort of awakened an interest in, where are some of the parents of my friends? Each time I come back here, I manage to track down a few more. And admittedly, while time is running short, because most of those people are in their 70s and late 80s now, it's been really heartening. The last time I was here, I went to a memorial service for Gene Teltner and Maurice Shapiro's cousin as well. And while it was at an apartment clubhouse, it was really wonderful to see most of the people who I knew as my parents' contemporaries as a child. It's also nice to know that the Jewish community in many respects thrives here, because I have never been in this building before that the interview is being taken in. While construction and planning started on it while I lived here in the late 60s and early 70s, I was one of the kids who hung out, played basketball, sold salami sandwiches, rehearsed with the Omaha Youth Symphony at the old Jewish Community Center on 20th and Dodge Street, which was in front of the Music Box bowling alley. That site is now paved over, and there's nothing there. So it's nice to see that not only have the things that were part of the past been removed, but things have been built to replace them, and that there's an infrastructure in the community. I also have to say that my grandmother spent her final days in the Rose Blumkin home, and I knew Rose and most of the kids in her family who are my age. My mother passed away, spent her final days in the Rose Blumkin home. My stepdad, Norman Rosen, passed away and spent his final days there. I had never had occasion to go there until my grandmother, my stepdad, and my mother were all there. And so, not growing up with these facilities here, when I come back now, I realize what you've done. And you've all done well, very well. I wasn't sure when I left just what I would find when I came back as a middle-aged man. But it's wonderful. And you've moved forward.